So today we'll have a look at a few patching ideas with clock dividers that you can experiment with and explore. This will work also with hardware, of course, and all of the ideas that we will look at today are available in my patching techniques and ideas document that I publish on Patreon with patch diagrams and patch examples in VCVrack. Links in the description if you are interested. And I want to quickly go through what is a clock divider. Here I have an LFO. This will be our clock source. Just because it's called a clock divider doesn't mean we have to use dedicated clock modules. We will see more examples of this later on. But for now, let's look at the pulse output on the scope. Right, this will go also to the input of the clock divider. This one is from Count Modular, but you can use other clock dividers. Again, also in hardware, there are many dedicated clock divider modules. And now the clock divider will count the incoming triggers, and we will get divisions of this pulse wave. For example, from the divided by 2, we get for each 2 pulses, we get 1 pulse, 1 gate. Divided by 4, this will be for each 4 pulses. Right, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then another one. Right, this clock divider is also, for example, prime numbers. So now this will be divided by 3, 1, 2, 3, and then another gate here. This is the green trace. Right, so let's start with some simple examples and build up from there. The first thing I want to show you is how you can create polyrhythms. I have here again the LFO is my clock source. Right, the pulse output is going to the clock input of the clock divider. And the first voice that we will trigger is the FM operator, which is here. I'm using the random module from VCV to generate pitch information and also to modulate it a bit. There's a link in the description to where you can download all of the patches we will look at today if you want to take a closer look. Right, so I will use the divided by 2 to trigger this voice. Right, and I will set this clock divider again to prime numbers. So now we have divided by 2, and the divided by 3 we'll use to trigger another voice. I have here a lovely chain with a kick roll from Befaco with some chorus and distortion. Right, so I will use the divided by 3. Right, already we get an interesting polyrhythm. I have here another voice. This is the string VCO from Surge, and I will use the divided by 5 to trigger it. Right, so all of this is coming from one LFO and one clock divider. A really interesting rhythm, or polyrhythms even. I will add some effects. I have here reverb and delay. Another fun technique that is a bit similar is to use the divisions together with logic to create unique rhythms even without a sequencer. In this case, we will use decimal divisions. Right, so we have divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. Right, I have here a kick drum with tremor 2 and the VCV logic module. Right, so let's say that I will use the 4 divided by 4 and divided by 5. This will go to the logic module. Again, also here I'm using a simple LFO to clock the clock divider. Right, and then from the logic module, from the OR output, we will basically get a combination of the divided by 4 and the divided by 5, a sort of a mixer or a logic mixer, if you will. So if I use this, the OR output, to trigger my kick drum, right, we get already an interesting rhythm. I can also use the AND output to bring in a sort of a cymbal voice with a noise section of tremor 2. Right, and AND logic means that whenever both divisions are playing, whenever both are high 4 and 5, this voice will be gated, this voice will play. So I will take it and I will trigger the noise section. This is going also through some delay. Here I have also a hi-hat, I have a white noise going through a bandpass filter and also some delay. Right, in this case I will use divided by 3 and divided by 7. And again I will use the OR combined result here to trigger the hi-hat. Here I have another voice, a snare with tremor, going through lots and lots of reverb. Right, and I will use the AND output to trigger it. So I can use the XOR output, which will give me a different combination of both divisions to gate the reverb. Another idea that involves logic is combining two divisions but delaying one of them to create all sorts of interesting wonky rhythms. And this technique will work best with using triggers, so if possible, set your clock divider to output triggers instead of gates. Here I have hi-hats with tremor. It will sound like this. Right, but now again I will use OR logic to combine the divided by 2 with the divided by 4, right? And we will use again the OR output to trigger the hi-hats. Right, so now we basically get the same results because the divided by 4 will happen together with the divided by 2, just every other clock. But I can now, for example, delay the divided by 2 with a trigger delay module. Here I have the one from Borg Audio. Right, I will send the divided by 2 to the trigger delay and then back to the logic and then start delaying this trigger. Right, and I can get an interesting rhythm. I can also choose to delay the divided by 4 and get something a bit different. Right, if I use a divided by 3 clock instead of divided by 4, right, you can get something like this, a bit wonky. Right, now if you want to try this in hardware, chances are you already have a trigger delay module. Here I have knock from Instruo. Right, most if not all function generators can work also as a trigger delay. So we will do this. Divided by 4 will go first to the logic module. Right, this will trigger the FM operator in this case. And then the divided by 2 will trigger knock, and I will use the end of cycle as my trigger. Right, and now the longer the envelope, the longer the delay will be, because again we are using the end of cycle output. Right, so we can get all sorts of interesting rhythms by delaying one of the divisions. Right, this will work also the same with something like Rampage and also maths for make noise. Right, so again I will use, let's say, divided by 3. This will go directly to trigger my voice through the logic module. In this case it's key call from Befaco. And I will use divided by 4 to trigger Rampage. End of cycle we will combine with the clock division, and now the longer the envelope, the longer it will take it to end, basically, so the more we delay the end of cycle output. Now again, just because it's called the clock divider doesn't mean we have to use it with dedicated clock modules. We can also use it with the trigger or gate sequencer. Here I have a 7-step sequence with the FM operator. The sequencer I'm using is the one from Count Modula. It will sound like this. Right, and I will use the actual triggers from the sequencer to drive or to clock the clock divider. Instead of using an LFO, instead of using a dedicated clock module, I'm using the triggers from the sequencer to drive the clock divider. Again, here I have it set to prime numbers, so I have divided by 3, 5, 7, and so on. So I can use, for example, the divided by 3 to trigger a bass with kick all from Befaco. I have here also dark energy from the geodesics. I can use a divided by 5. So again, the triggers or the clock source, let's say, is coming from the triggers from the sequencer. And the clock divider will spread this to 2 different voices in this case. And this can work really nicely also with something like a Euclidean sequencer with all sorts of interesting rhythms. So here again I have the one from Count Modula. This is driving the clock divider, and I have here a few drums with tremor 2, tremor 1, and some delay to sound like this. Another interesting source you can use is random triggers, and this can be a great foundation for a generative patch. I have here again an LFO. I'm using it to trigger a random source, which is then modulating the frequency of the LFO, right? The square output is triggering the random source, and the random source is modulating the frequency via the FM, which is triggering the random source, which is modulating. So we have a feedback loop, a modulation feedback loop that is a great source for a generative clock. Right, I have here also 2 FM operators, right, more or less the same voices. One is just an octave up, right, and I can use, for example, a divided by 3 to gate one of them, and a divided by 5 to gate the other. Right, so we still have the generative clock, but the clock divider will add more space in between the notes, in between the voices. Here I have a nice bass drone I can add to this with the modern VCO. And I can use maybe a divided by 11 to trigger a gate source I have here with noise plethora. Right, so divided by 11, this will add even more space. Another way of adding space and generating random variation is mixing the clock divider with a random source. For example, if I use a clock division of 8 to trigger a bass drum or a kick drum, right, we get a steady rhythm, but I will use the same division to trigger a random source. Maybe I will zoom in a bit. I have here the random module from VCV, so the same division will trigger this random source. Right, and I will mix it in with the gates from the divider, right? So I have here a CV mixer that I can use to mix CV signals. Let's send this also to the scope here, right? This will be the same clock division, right? But now I can mix in the random source that will push this up and down, right, and will create more variation and will add more space and randomness to this stream of gates. Right, I can do the same or something similar with the noise section of Tremor 2 to create sorts of hi-hats, but I will use the divided by 4 as my main clock, right? This will go to the mixer, and the divided by 2 to trigger the random source. right? So we might get more rhythmic variation at certain points. Right, I have here also a bass voice with key call from Befaco. So I will use the divided by 16 in this case as my main gate source, as my steady source. And then again the divided by 2 to trigger the random source. And again they are mixed with the CV mixer. Another fun technique that involves also sample and hold is creating harmony. Here I have a simple 8-step sequence. I can show you this quickly with the FM operator. This is coming from the ADDR sequencer. It will sound like this. Right, so a simple 8-step sequence. But now we will use sample and hold to sample this sequence only at specific times, and for this we will use the sample and hold module from VC eurorack. It's also a shift register, but we will use it just as a sample and hold in this case. Right, so I will send the sequence to the first channel. We have here multiple channels. Right, use the LFO to drive or to clock the clock divider. Again, I will use decimal values, so we have divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So let's start with the division of 3. Right, this will trigger the sample and hold. Only with the division of 3, this sequence will be sampled and will go to the FM operator, and the same division will also trigger it or gate it. Right, so only together with the division or the divided by 3 clock, the sequence will be sampled, or a snapshot of the sequence will be taken, and this will go to the FM operator. I have here also the modern VCO with the filter and some delay. Right, for this we will use the divided by 5. So again, I will use the same sequence. Right, again we have multiple channels here of sample and hold. So I will use the same sequence, but in this case a division of 5. This will go to the modern VCO, and I will use the same division also to gate it. And again, this is coming from the same 8-step sequence. Here I have the VCV, VCO, again, crossfading between different waveforms using a filter. Right, and in this case I will use a division of 7. Right, so again I use the same sequence. A division of 7 will trigger the sample and hold, or will gate the sample and hold, and this will go back to the voice. Right, the same with the sine VCO, but let's use now a division of 9. Again, the same sequence, division of 9, and this will go back to the voice. Right, and all of this is coming from this simple 8-step sequence. But again, thanks to the clock divider, we can split this sequence and create harmony. Another way of generating unique pitch sequences with a clock divider is by mixing the different divisions and using them as pitch information. For example, if I use the divided by 2, here I have the VCA mixer, right, divided by 2, divided by 3 in this case, and divided by 4, right, this will be the result we will get. You can see this on the scope, right, I'm just mix the different divisions. Right, and you will see the more divisions happening at the same time, the more voltage, the higher the pitch, and vice versa. So if I will send this to the quantizer, right, maybe I will reduce the overall level because we will use this for pitch information. Right, I can use this to sequence a voice that I have here with the FM operator. Right, the sequence is coming from the clock divider by mixing the different divisions. If I add, for example, divided by 7, we will get a longer sequence, more variation. Right, of course, the levels of the different divisions will also influence the resulting sequence. Right, I have here another clock divider generating another sequence, in this case divided by 8, 16 and 32 for a bass voice. I love using clock divisions to insert some sort of variation into simple repetitive sequences, like for example changing the level of a sequence and by that also the sequence itself. Here I have a simple 8-step sequence again with the ADDR sequencer sequencing the VCV VCO. Right, it will sound like this. But now I can send this sequence, the actual pitch information, to a VCA for the quantizer, right? And now the level of the VCA will change the sequence, less voltage, lower pitch, more voltage, higher pitch. Right, so I can use a clock division of 8, let's say, to drive a second sequencer. I have here another ADDR sequencer, and this will change the levels of the VCA. Right, and we get variation of this sequence. We can also use a clock divider to gate voices, again together with the VCA, or you can use it also with logic if you want, with AND logic. But here I have a random sequence going. I have the random module from VCV sequencing or sending pitch information to the FM operator. Right, and I can use a division of 16, let's say, to cut off the gates. I have the gates to the FM operator going first through a VCA, so when the VCA is closed, no gates go through and the FM operator will not play. So if I use, for example, a division of 16, right, we can gate this voice and add more space to our patches. A great technique for creating a ratcheting effect is using a sequential switch and a clock multiplier, but a clock multiplier is not so common, especially not in hardware, and you can get the same effect also with the clock divider. Here I have a sequence, the sec3 is sequencing again the FM operator, it will sound like this. Right, and now instead of using the LFO as the clock like I'm doing now, I will use the LFO to clock the clock divider, and I will use, let's say, a division of 32 to drive the sequencer, and now raise the rate of the LFO to get more or less the same frequency or the same BPM. Right, something like this. So we get the same rate from the divided by 32, but now we have the previous divisions that we can use actually as a multiplication of this clock, and we can use this for ratcheting with a sequential switch. So the gate from the voice, right, instead of coming from the sequencer, it will come from the switch. Right, the first input again will be the divided by 32, which is the normal clock, but we can use the divided by 16, the divided by 8, and the divided by 4, which are actually in this case multiplications, right? The 32 is our original clock, and then we have multiplications of this clock that we can use. Now for clocking or triggering the clock divider, right, I will use the triggers from the sequencer. And we get ratcheting. Something definitely worth experimenting with is feeding back the clock divider into itself, creating all sorts of weird rhythms. So for this, I will send the LFO first to a mixer. I have here again the CV mix from VCV. Right, this will go to the scope just so we can see what's going on, and this will go also to the clock input of the clock divider. And I will open this channel on the mixer just enough so the clock divider will start working. Right, it's already triggering kick all from Befaco. Right, and something to keep in mind is that this technique will work best with triggers instead of gates. So again, I will switch the clock divider to output triggers, and I will use the division or divided by 4. I will send it back to the mixer, right? So we have the LFO going to the clock divider, and then the clock divider back to the mixer, and back to the clock divider, and back to the mixer. And now I will not only add this division, I will also invert it. And listen to what will happen. Right, this is the rhythm we get by feeding back the clock divider into itself. Now this will work also with different divisions and will give us different results. So for example, divided by 8. Right, or if I go again to prime numbers, this will be divided by 3. Or divided by 5. Right, so again, we are feeding back the clock divider into itself with the help of a mixer and creating unique rhythms. I have here a kick drum, and again I'm mixing, or I'm creating a feedback loop here with a clock divider. And I have also some hi-hats with another clock divider. We can also use the clock divisions as a modulation source, and with the help of slew limiters we can turn the pulse-shaped signals into something smoother. Here I have a sequence with Entropia from the geodesics, sequencing dark energy, also geodesics. It will sound like this. Right, and here I have a clock divider, and I can use, for example, a divided by 5 clock. Right, and we can see the result here on the scope. Together with a slew limiter, I can smoothen out this shape and create something like a triangle wave even, that I can then use as a synced modulation source, right? For example, to modulate the timbre here. Right, I can also use a divided by 7 with another slew limiter, right, and create another synced modulation source. And from here, right, and add more rhythmic layers to this sound. Right, and if you don't have slew limiters in your system, you can use also envelopes, of course. Use the clock divisions to trigger envelopes and then using them as modulation, just like I'm doing here. You can see doing here with the FM operator. Right, and also depending on the low-pass filters you have in your system, you might also use them as slew limiters. Here, for example, this is the VCV VCF. I'm sending a clock division to its input, as you can see on the scope. And the more I lower the frequency or the cutoff, right, the more smooth or the smoother the signal will become. And we can use this for modulation without any clicks and pops or anything. Right, the same with the filter here from Nano. I lower the cutoff and you can see the signal becomes, it has like a slew to it. Clock dividers can also be used to generate sub-oscillations, and depending on the clock divider you have, you might also be able to use it to generate sub-harmonics. Here I have a pulse wave from the VCV-VCO going directly to the clock input of the clock divider. Right, this is the original wave. Right, and now if I use the divided by 2, we will get an octave down. Divided by 4 will give us 2 octaves down. Right, I can add some chorus and filtering. Right, and we get a nice thick sound from just one oscillator. And again, depending on the clock divider you use, you might also get sub-harmonics. Right, so here again I have the VCO. In this case it's tuned 2 octaves up, just so we have more range to work with when we divide it down. Right, so this is the original sound. And now I can use, for example, the divided by 3 to get a sub-harmonic. The same with divided by 5. Right, from the divided by 6, we will get the same as the divided by 3, but just an octave down. Right, I can modulate their levels and create a nice drone. I have here the quad LFO from Surge that will randomly bring them in and out. Add some reverb. Very nice. Just like we can create sub-oscillations and harmonics, we can also use more complex sources and distort the sound. Here I have some drums, the gate sequencer from Impromptu, sequencing a kick and a hi-hat, and a snare with a gated reverb. It will sound like this. Right, so now I can mix the drums into a clock divider. So let's use the kick and hi-hat, and maybe the signal from the reverb to both of the channels, why not? This will go to the clock divider, and then from the divided by 2 we'll get a distorted version. Let's mix it in. Right. This is just a sound, just a distortion. Right, I can use also the divided by 4 and create a stereo signal. Right, so together with the original drums, this adds another layer of complexity to the sound. And this can work also with melodic voices. I have here the FM operator, or 2 FM operators as an FM voice, sequenced by the probably key from Impromptu, going through some delay to sound like this. Right, and then I'm using the signal after the delay, again a more complex signal, a more complex sound source, going to the clock divider. Again I'm using the divided by 2, divided by 4 as a stereo voice, and I'm using a modulated bandpass filter after it just to create another effect. This will be just a distorted sound. Right? Again, adding another layer of complexity. Now we just need the bass. I have here again kick call from the Faco with this lovely chain distortion filter. Now, if you don't have a clock divider in your setup or you just want to experiment, you can also use a sequencer as a clock divider. Here I have noise playing the original clock, just noise going through a bandpass filter. Right, so this is basically our clock source from the LFO. Right, and now let's say that I want to divide this clock by 2. So I have here the 8-step trigger sequencer from Count Modula. I set one sequence to have only 2 steps and set the first step active. So now we have a clock division of 2, and I can use this, for example, to trigger another voice, the FM operator. Right, and you can hear the connection or the relation with the original clock coming from the hi-hats. Right, if I want it divided by 3, let's say I set a sequence of 3 steps. Right, we can compare this also with a dedicated clock divider. So this is from the sequencer, and now from the divider, we have the same result. Right, and again, we can create polyrhythms this way, just like we've seen at the beginning of this video. So let's say the second sequence will have 5 steps, and again, just the first step active. This will trigger a bass with kick all. We can have it divided by 4, set a sequence length to have 4 steps, and again, the first step active. This will trigger another voice I have here with the Pony VCO. Right, so we get polyrhythms. This will work also with the feedback patch example or with the feedback technique we've seen before. And again, as I mentioned, this will work best with triggers. So I'm using here the gates module from VCV to convert this gate into a trigger. So I have here the LFO going through a CV mixer. Again, I will open it just enough so it will start running the sequence. Right, in this case, it's a clock division of 5, and I have here a clock division of 4 going back again as a trigger back to the mixer. So again, we're not only mixing it in, we will also invert it. Right? And we get a unique rhythm by feedback patching. So most of the techniques will work also with the sequencer as a clock divider. Again, if you don't have a clock divider in your system or you just want to experiment, you can also use a trigger sequencer as a clock divider. Again, all of these techniques and many more are available in the Patching Techniques and Ideas document. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Cheers.